The violence that occurred after the 2007 Kenyan presidential election was caused by tribal rivalries between the Kikuyu tribe and the Luo tribe. The Kikuyus are the largest tribe in Kenya out of about 40 total tribes, while the Luo are the third largest tribe. According to the Washington Post, the Kikuyus make up about 22% of the population, while the Luo make up 13%. These two tribes are known to be heavily involved in Kenyan politics. There have been many disputes between the tribes in Kenya, but the rivalry between the Kikuyu and the Luo has dated back for many years. The conflict started after the British stopped occupying Kenya. The tension between the tribes was mostly due to the fact that they did not agree on how much land should be distributed between them. The two candidates for the 2007 election are Mwai Kibaki, who is part of the Kikuyu tribe, and Raila Odinga, who is part of the Luo tribe. When Kibaki was declared the winner in the election, Odinga disputed the results, alleging that the voting was rigged. Soon after the results of the election was announced, violence erupted, which was not only fueled by the election results, but also decades of economic frustration and ethnic rivalry. The violence that occurred was mostly caused by people in the Luo tribe who want to target Kikuyus in an act of revolt. However, some of the deaths were also caused by the police who attempted to stop the riots.
One U.S. diplomat is already calling the killing in Kenya, quote, ethnic cleansing. Post-election violence continues, turning into tribal slaughter, pitting neighbor against neighbor.
It didn't take long for President Mwai Kibaki's security forces to claim the upper hand. This is what Kenya's opposition leader calls the killing fields of the innocent. Raila Odinga says it's where police execute protesters at will in what he calls unprecedented bloodlust, which he blames on the president.
Violence occurred in many parts of the country, but was mostly prevalent in areas such as the Nairobi slums, Nyanza Province, the Rift Valley, and the coast.
The Great Rift Valley is ablaze here. Rival tribes run out of their homes with fire. Oh my goodness, look at all this. Tribe-on-tribe violence ignited ferociously after last month's disputed election result. Village after village scorched. The Shambas fields are silent, empty. This was Kenya's breadbasket. Victims flee their homes, fearful of much worse.
Yes, they are using this to cut.
On the ground, the people say a young man of their clan had his eyes poked out, hacked, then burned to death. This is how they lashed back.
The death toll was estimated to be at about 1,300, while more than 600,000 people suffered from injury. From these events, I believe that there was an incitement to genocide, because after the election, Raila Odinga called for civil disobedience, which ultimately led to the violence.
Raila Odinga is not backing down. He insists he's Kenya's rightful president and that the election was stolen.
We want to bring pressure on this government to understand that the people of this country are angry about what they've done to the people.
He's calling for mass action, countrywide protests for 3 days later this week.
No Raila! No peace! We don't want dialogue! No peace!
The events that occurred during the 2007 Kenyan election can only be defined as a genocide based on international legal canon. Both the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in Article 2 and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in Article 6 define genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And this describes the actions that happened shortly after the election, since after Kibaki was announced president, the Luos began to riot, and most of the violence was aimed at people who were in the Kikuyu tribe.
There are several factors that must be considered when deciding who is to blame for the genocide that occurred following the Kenyan election of 2007. Are groups within the state government itself, other states in Africa, NGOs, or IGOs the most culpable? Let's start with the ethnic tribes who are the major participants in this election. The Kikuyu and the Luo are two of the largest tribes in Kenya, and accordingly, they provided the two major candidates for the election, Kibaki and Odinga. Kibaki was declared the victor of the election, but it is widely agreed upon that the Kikuyu tribe tampered with election results in order to ensure that he would win. The Luo were justifiably outraged by this act, so they made their anger clear by protesting both violently and non-violently. In this way, the actions of both ethnic groups within the state directly caused the deaths of over 1,000 Kenyans following the election. However, the state government is also at fault for the violence that occurred. It was clear that the Kikuyu had tampered with election results, but the election commission in charge of tallying votes did not take responsibility, or even acknowledge their interference. According to the New York Times, the European Union claimed that election officials initially announced that Kibaki had won with 50,141 votes. But a week later, that number suddenly jumped to 75,261 votes without reason.
Opposition supporters believe the poll was rigged, and now there's new evidence to fuel their anger. Kenya's National Commission on Human Rights says more than the maximum number of voters cast ballots in some constituencies. It found election observers were turned away during counting and says it can't verify over 360,000 votes. President Kibaki won by just 230,000. But the tragedy for Kenya is that no one will ever know who won for sure.
The government's failure to host a legitimate election is undeniable. Furthermore, when Luo protests began, police reacted with excessive force, violently pushing back protesters. The police were responsible for a significant number of the deaths and injuries that occurred. On the other hand, nearby African states and international organizations greatly contributed to efforts to resolving the issue and restoring peace in Kenya. Mr. Kufuor, President of Ghana and Chairman of the African Union, took measures to begin negotiations between the two presidential candidates, Kibaki and Luo. Kufuor was not successful himself because the two tribes refused to negotiate, but he knew that all hope was not lost. Eventually, Kibaki and Luo realized that peace in Kenya must be restored, or the country would be in serious danger. So Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations, stepped in. Annan would oversee future interactions and negotiations between the two tribes. Peace in Kenya was still a possibility.
Ambassador Ricardo Alberto Arias of Panama, whose country holds the rotating presidency, urged political leaders to foster reconciliation, saying that the only solution to the current crisis lies through dialogue, negotiation and compromise. The council welcomed the face-to-face talks between President Mwai Kibaki and Raila Odinga. The council said the two leaders should meet their responsibility to engage fully in finding a sustainable political solution and taking action to immediately end the violence. However, the UN institution expressed its deep concern about the continued killing of civilians and the displacement of thousands of Kenyans, and specifically wants action to be taken.
As seen by their respective contributions to the maintenance of peace in Kenya, the tribes within Kenya and the Kenyan government are much more culpable for the thousands of deaths and the hundreds of thousands of injuries that occurred than the other states, non-governmental organizations, and international organizations. While the groups within Kenya and the Kenyan government directly caused the flawed elections and violence, external governments and organizations solely attempted to resolve the state's issues. However, the Kenyans refused to cooperate, and as a result, violence within the state continued for several months. Thus, the Kibaki tribe, the Luo tribe, and the Kenyan government bear the final responsibility for the issues, and should be punished by restricting their political and economic rights on the international level until negotiations have been successfully reached. Both tribes should be willing to compromise on this matter, or violence will continue in Kenya and the country will fall into chaos. Other states, like Ghana and the US, and international organizations, such as the African Union and the United Nations, should continue to promote and oversee negotiations in order to ensure that peace is restored in Kenya.